jails.
We went in with shotguns and pick handles and whatever, you know, and we stopped whatever was going on. If one got hit in the process, he just got hit.
During its 130-year history, Angola has recorded chilling scenes of misery, escape, and murder.
He was able to smuggle this meat cleaver to his dormitory, and during the night he attacked 2 prisoners, and they never knew what hit them.
Most of the inmates who survived the violence will never see the outside world again.
Majority, half of them here are, have life sentences, and that's going to be for murder or some kind of, drug thing, and then 85% of them thereabouts will probably die here.
To keep its 5,000 inmates inside, the prison is equipped to chase them down through fields, over water, and far into the dense backcountry of Louisiana. To carry out the state's wishes, Angola is also prepared to administer the ultimate punishment: execution. Over time, Angola has housed a diverse group, from murderers and sex offenders to criminals who had been singers and entertainers. Robert Willie, convicted murderer. His story inspired the movie Dead Man Walking. John B. Simonis, the ski mask rapist, locked up here for a string of sexual attacks that spanned 12 states. The legendary blues singer, Leadbelly, convicted of attempted murder, recorded his first song here. The story of Louisiana State Penitentiary begins in 1869, 4 years after the end of the Civil War. At that time, nearly half the people living in the state were recently freed slaves. Unskilled, illiterate, and unable to make a living, many turned to crime. Their offenses ranged from larceny and breaking and entering to horse thievery and forcible rape. The wave of lawbreakers was too much for Louisiana's few jails to cope with. And so the state found a place to house this growing convict population, a huge expanse of land that would eventually encompass 18,000 acres. Originally a slave plantation, it was named for the region in Africa where many slaves had been born, Angola. The 28-square-mile plantation was, and still is, the largest state prison in America. Bordered on 3 sides by the Mississippi River, it is very nearly an island.
So if you were picking a location to isolate convicts from the rest of society, you could not really find a more ideal location than Angola. It's probably one of the most remote physical locations, not only in Louisiana, but probably in the United States.
Initially, Angola was not operated by the state, but as a private enterprise. The idea came from a former major in the Confederate Army, Samuel Lawrence James. After the war, James made a deal with the state of Louisiana. He would pay to house and feed the prisoners. In exchange, he was permitted to use them as laborers.
He took the mostly black convicts who were recently freed slaves and put them to doing the same type of labor that they would have done pre-Civil War under slavery.
It was punishment for profit. The plantation prison even had its own cotton gin. But critics labeled it as nothing more than a new form of slavery.
Probably it was worse than the early slave plantations because the slave owners had bought and paid for the slaves, so they took care of them. But Samuel James had no regard for the lives of the prisoners. He was only interested in the profit he could gain from the work that they did.
Inmates toiled from dawn to darkness. Their backbreaking tasks included building levees to prevent floods, planting corn, picking cotton, and cutting sugarcane.
This is a line pusher stick, and it was used by the person that was setting the pace in the cane field. And if the other prisoners were not working as hard or doing what he thought they should do, he'd prod them along. Sometimes they'd probably whack them, several whacks.
Before 1900, the average lifespan for an Angola inmate was just 5 years. The food was poor, and early records list malaria and dysentery among the illnesses that might go untreated. Major James summed up his regard for the prisoners with a grim phrase: "One dies, get another."
The meaning of that being that if a convict died at Angola, then the next boatload coming up the river from Baton Rouge brought you another convict to replace him.
More than 100 years later, Angola's prisoners still call it the farm. They still work the land under armed guard.
You get up in the morning and you go into the fields, and you might be in a line of 40, 50 other people. And we're kind of like walking like zombies. We didn't know where we were going. And you just go in the field and do what they tell you to do, and it seems like everything work all right. And if you do as you was instructed, do the best you can do.
While their work hours have been reduced to reflect modern penal philosophy, the scene is still an eerie reminder of a bygone era.
It's a humongous big old prison farm. We have 2,000 acres of corn and soybeans and cotton. We produce 4 million pounds of vegetables. You're passing by some of the agricultural area now. We work with horses and mules, and we work with modern tractors, so you won't see that in any other prison, really. We do a lot of primitive work and hand work. We harvest the cotton by hand, and we harvest the vegetables by hand. Why not? We have the labor.
For the first convicts at Angola, life was an earthly hell. Improvements would come, but slowly, and only after a legacy of brutality and bloodshed had been firmly established. When it opened in 1869, Louisiana's state prison at Angola challenged its staff with vast distances and open spaces. Rather than construct a traditional prison compound, small camps were scattered miles apart in order to house the convicts close to their work. The first, called Camp A, was a wooden barracks built on the site of the plantation's original slave quarters. There was no radio tower as there is today, and news of trouble was carried through the air by the sound of a rifle shot or the crack of a whip.
This strap was used to punish prisoners that didn't work fast enough or didn't do the work properly out in the cane fields.
Prison guards had a cruel term for the whippings: more lash, more cash.
I would think it would be very demoralizing. The foreman would order the prisoner to the headlands, make them lie down, face down, spread eagle, and he would have a strong man hold each arm and each leg, and then he would administer 10 to 15 strokes.
In 1901, the state took over the prison, but the punishing conditions did not end. By 1930, Angola's inmate population had grown to 3,000. While most of Louisiana had embraced the 20th century, the prison remained a throwback to the 1800s. Medical treatment was scarce. The prison's hospital served mostly as a convenient place for inmates to die. As many as 50 a year succumbed to tuberculosis, while weaker patients were carried off by pneumonia and influenza. Conditions became so bad that a prison nurse later described Angola to newspaper reporters as a sewer of degradation. But even in the face of the suffering, Angola's inmates clung to their humanity. Photos from the earliest days reveal convicts escaping the drudgery through music. From this unlikely background came one of the most legendary blues performers of the century, Huddie Ledbetter, known as Leadbelly. Born in the 1880s on a plantation in North Louisiana, Leadbelly left home as a young man to make his living as a musician. But during a Salvation Army concert in 1930, Leadbelly's violent side got him into trouble. Court records show that Leadbelly was told by the white Salvation Army officers to stop dancing to the music. Then, a fight broke out in which Leadbelly wielded a knife. He was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sent to Angola. It was in Angola in July of 1934 that Leadbelly met folklorist John Lomax and his son Alan, who were touring the South for the Library of Congress. The team was collecting unwritten ballads and folk songs using newly available recording technology. The Lomaxes had discovered that Southern prisons were among the best places to collect work songs, ballads, and spirituals, but Leadbelly was a particular find. Along with the Leadbelly standard Goodnight Irene, the Lomaxes agreed to record Leadbelly's plea for a pardon. In the summer of 1934, they took the record to Louisiana's governor, O.K. Allen. He was so moved that a month later, Leadbelly was freed. Huddie Ledbetter went north to New York City. By 1937, he was a popular attraction in clubs and among music lovers. Later, he traveled to France and became the first country blues man ever to perform in Europe. The 1930s also brought Angola its most famous escape. It was 1933 when a man named Charlie Frazier was sent here to serve 30 years for bank robbery and murder. At the time of his conviction, he was wanted in 2 other states for 52 other robberies, 6 kidnappings, 11 shootings, and a prison break. He was not about to be stopped by a prison farm.
Charlie Frazier instigated one of the most daring escapes at Angola. He and 10 other inmates broke out of Camp H. They shot Captain Singleton and wounded another inmate. They succeeded in getting away from the prison and getting to North Louisiana.
After a bank robbery spree through northern Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas, Frazier was captured and returned to Angola. This time, prison officials were waiting for him with a new cell block known as the Red Hats.
It was called Red Hats because the people who were confined there were forced to wear straw hats that had been dipped in red paint so that you could see them when they were out of their cells. They were marked in that fashion as being people that you needed to keep an eye on because they were serious disciplinary risks.
To prevent another escape, Charlie Frazier is said to have been locked in his cell in the Red Hats building for 8 years with the door welded shut. Although it is no longer in operation, the cement dungeon was used to punish prisoners as recently as 1972. George Eliot has been in Angola nearly half a century and was one of the last to do hard time in the Red Hats. He is serving 75 years for armed robbery.
Well, I stayed 2 years in the Red Hats. Last time was cell 5. I wouldn't want to go through that again. The buildings were old. You had a concrete bed. You had big bars, pipes like in your windows. They weren't really bars. There was no screen, no glass. They give you a little GI bowl of water twice a day. You could drink it or you could flush your commode with it. If it rained in on you. If it was cold, you were cold. The rest of the time, the mosquitoes ate you up.
Outside the Red Hats building, conditions were never much better. Inmates lived in crowded dormitories guarded by fellow convicts called trustee guards.
The trustee guard system relied on certain inmates who were usually people convicted of violent crimes, usually manslaughter, murder cases, people who killed their friends and loved ones rather than people who killed strangers, more predatory types of criminals. And these people were given weapons and guarded other convicts, particularly when they worked in the fields.
The trustee guard system had begun in 1917 when state officials fired the salaried staff as a way to save money. For 55 years, the only people carrying guns inside Angola were the inmates. Isolated, remote, enormous, yet unseen. Louisiana's 28-square-mile prison farm, Angola, had escaped real public scrutiny since its first prisoners arrived 5 years after the Civil War. By the early 1950s, at a time when prison reform had taken hold across the country, investigators would find the conditions inside Angola horrifying. Inmates worked 12 hours a day on 28 cents worth of food. Lack of facilities forced 250 men in one barracks to share 4 primitive toilets. Narcotics were freely available and their use among the prisoners was rising. And at night, in the dormitories, those convicted of sex crimes got retribution from other inmates.
Back in them days, a rapist had a pretty hard way to go. 9 times out of 10, he got raped right here. But you couldn't watch him. You didn't have no people up in them dormitories with him, you know. They'd catch him in the shower room or something at night, you know, when he went to bed. They would make him pay.
Monroe Green has served 35 years on a life sentence for rape.
Oh my God. At night when they closed and locked the doors, every man was on his own. You were either a good guy or bad guy, and there was no in between. And a lot of things you couldn't do anything about. You see, it was hell.
Inmate rape was very common.
During this troubled period in 1952, Maurice Sigler arrived at Angola to take over as warden.
The big camps that we had there where the people slept, they were locked upstairs at night and after the evening meal. And nobody went up there at all.
Also in 1952, Collier's magazine labeled Angola America's worst prison. Under Warden Sigler and a legislative mandate to clean up the institution, Angola showed marked improvement in a short span of time. By 1955, a state-produced film acknowledged the mistakes at Angola and informed the public that a reform effort was underway.
A man felt doomed when he went to Angola. This was the end of the road. Dressed in big striped canvas, which branded him an outcast, he lived under conditions more fit for animals than for men. Few citizens of Louisiana knew the real conditions, but those who knew wondered, was Angola too rotten to be saved? Who cared anyway?
Part truth and part propaganda, the film offered a sugar-coated glimpse of Angola's future. Modern buildings were constructed to feed and educate prisoners. New, larger dormitories would ease the crowded conditions. Machine shops and factories were added where inmates could learn a useful skill while crafting license plates. A state-of-the-art cell block was opened to house a growing number of troublemakers. Prisoners no longer wore stripes and instead were issued comfortable uniforms as soon as they were processed into the prison. Education and psychological testing were added to the program, and medical attention was now offered to all who required it. Even the dairy cows were living better, having been cured of Bang's disease, an infection that had plagued the herd for years. Yet, for all the appearance of improvement, the sprawling prison was headed for more hard times. Within 20 years, it would earn a new reputation. Instead of the worst prison in America, Angola was destined to be called the bloodiest.
In the early 1970s, the inmate population got up to over 4,000 inmates with a total of maybe 300 security officers at that time, remembering that at any given time, only about 50 of those officers would be working at any particular time period.
The trusty guard system had been abolished in 1973, but no new guards had been hired to replace them.
Most of the violence occurred after the men were locked up at night because there was no supervision of any kind, although there were murders during the daytime also.
Those guards that remained were spread thinly around the perimeter to prevent escapes. Inside, the prisoners were free to kill each other.
In that period, Angola was certainly the bloodiest prison in the country. They were averaging 1 or 2 inmate fatalities a month, usually from stabbings, and another 20 to 30 stabbings, almost 1 stabbing a day, serious enough to require medical treatment.
Joseph Lee Woods arrived in Angola in 1972 with a life sentence for murder. He was 15 years old.
And when I was coming out the cell block through the main prison control center, I saw 2 inmates laying there dead, waiting to be taken to the hospital. And the reason I know they're dead because they were just laying there. And as I was walking down the walk, I see what kind of places I'm in. When I went in the dorm that same night, they had 2 more stabbings. And Angola was being labeled as one of the most bloodiest maximum security prisons in the nation. And they put me right in the midst of it.
In June of 1975, a federal judge intervened with a court order. It declared that conditions at Angola constituted an extreme public emergency. It called for the state of Louisiana to appropriate millions of dollars to improve prison security and add protection for the inmates and guards. Over time, conditions at Angola have been transformed dramatically. Today, most of Angola's 5,000 inmates still live in dormitories, but they are clean and open. Guarded around the clock by trained corrections officers, they have become a relatively safe place to live. New inmates, or fresh fish as they are called in prison jargon, are housed in a maximum security cell block until their tendency for violent behavior can be evaluated. Weapons and drugs, although still a problem, are controlled by Angola's shakedown team. Every cell is subject to a random search at any time. The officers are thorough, and their method ensures that every article of clothing and furnishing is checked. The cell toilet, long overlooked as a hiding place for contraband, is carefully inspected. Food and other personal items are checked by hand, examined, and even sniffed for evidence of drugs. Even a suspicious toothbrush, possibly a homemade weapon, is confiscated in an effort to send the message that Angola's staff is now firmly in control. Trouble on Angola's farm lines has been reduced with the visible threat of deadly force.
I've never had to shoot an inmate that ran from a line, never in my career, 18 years, because they know we will. And since they know we will, then they don't challenge us. You know, you're convicted. It's not innocent till guilty. I mean, you're guilty when you're committed to prison. So therefore, you don't read a Miranda or anything else. If you break from the line and you run, they're going to shoot a warning shot, and the second shot, they're going to shoot you. and they're going to shoot to wound you, but if they're shooting a shotgun, that's hard.
The inmates also know that with 18,000 acres of farmland spreading out in every direction, there is no place for them to run. Louisiana's maximum security prison at Angola. Surrounded by water on 3 sides and by forbidding terrain on the 4th, it is no wonder this place has been called the Alcatraz of the South. Still, escape is part of the history here. Hilton Butler is the first of 3 generations to work at the prison. He started as a guard in 1952 and retired as Angola's warden in 1989.
When I first come here, you didn't even have an escape law. You just caught them and brought them back. And you didn't have very many people working here. You didn't have good fences like they have now that raise a ribbon and all that.
In fact, an astounding 40 miles of razor wire now encloses Angola's 6 security perimeters. Escape should seem hopeless, if not impossible, yet it remains a constant concern.
You know, they will escape. It's not that I can't ever have an escape. I'm going to have an escape. I'm just going to catch him.
We have guys with, several hundred years. Even we've had guys with several thousand years sentenced. So if you get a couple of thousand years from the judge, you're not going to sleep well at night. Your dream every night will be, I'm not going to be here the first chance I get.
And it's going to happen. We're going to catch him. He's going to run. He's supposed to run. If I was him, I'd run too. Wouldn't you?
The first to spot an escapee might be a guard in one of the towers.
She fires a warning shot, and you can do all of this quicker than getting on the phone, because once you hear a shot, everyone responds to that.
The next to be alerted will do their jobs close to the ground. The chase dogs, Clyde, Kilo, and Josie.
Come on, Josie. Come on, baby. Hey, girl. Hey, girl, Josie. This is Josie. This is the best dog we have right now. She's about 6 years old. She's trained to follow a man wherever he goes.
Johnny Dixon learned to handle the prison bloodhounds from his father, who in turn learned from his father at the prison. It's a tradition handed down through 100 years of Angola history.
Hunt for him, baby. Hunt for him. See the difference? Hunt for him, girl. Atta girl. Come on, baby. Now see right then, she was on somebody's trail that walked out across there. See, she's still wanting to go on it. You can't hardly hold her back on an actual trail. Wherever he goes, she'll follow. Come on, Josie. Come on, girl. Come on, baby.
To keep the dogs in practice, one of Angola's officers stages a mock escape by dashing into the woods. The bloodhounds will follow his trail, as if he were a convict on the run.
Atta girl. Atta girl. Atta girl. We train in plowed dirt. We train in grass fields, weed fields, short grass. We train in everything. So that way it doesn't matter what that guy goes through, we can follow him.
To supplement the dogs and officers on foot, the warden has 4 military armored personnel carriers at his disposal. They are unstoppable even by Angola's most treacherous terrain.
For an inmate to escape, he's got to go through about 20 miles of this. This is some of the roughest terrain in Louisiana. If we would just go around this and wait on the other side and bring the bloodhound through it and push him on out, when he comes out, we're going to be there to catch him.
For an inmate who might choose the Mississippi River as an escape route, Angola's chase boat, the Miss Debbie, can be called into action.
And that's a converted shrimp boat that the sheriff in New Orleans confiscated as a drug running boat, and we refurbished it and made it into a chase boat. It's called the Miss Debbie. It's named after my wife, Debbie, so that's what I named it. Why not? I had to pick something for it.
Equipped with night vision scopes and sonar, the prison's boat is able to track an escaped inmate in the water even at night. But most escapees never make it past the plantation's 18,000 acres of farmland. They're usually caught by the tried and true method, the bloodhounds.
What for? When we see that dog's tail start wagging, we pull our pistols. Now that dog's tail will be just like it is right now, going through the woods, no indication at all. Whenever that dog gets in a certain spot and starts indicating that tail starts wagging, you can pull your pistol, buddy. He's laying right there. Had a girl. Had a girl.
Standing beside Angola's remarkable history of escapes is the prison's legacy of meting out the ultimate punishment, execution. For 50 years, Louisiana housed its electric chair at Angola. Originally, the state's executions were carried out in the parish where the crime had occurred.
You had the electric chair and a generator mounted on a truck, and you went to the town where the crime was committed, and I carried the chair out a couple of times to those places like that before it was brought in here permanent.
In 1957, the electric chair was installed in a wing of the infamous Red Hats building, where a replica stands today. 87 inmates have donned this leather face mask and had the thick leather restraints buckled around their wrists and ankles. Then, while witnesses watched, the executioner threw the switch that put the condemned to death. Robert Williams, a convicted murderer, was electrocuted here in 1983. John Taylor, another murderer, was strapped into Angola's electric chair in April of 1984. And Elmo Saunier, a rapist and killer, was put to death here 2 months later.
Do they have any last words they want to say? I've asked them all that I was involved with, and you know, some of them say, well, they committed a sin and they want they're right with the Lord and they're ready to die, but they want to ask the victim's family to forgive them. And I had one little old boy. I asked him, I said, "Do you have any last words you want to say?" "Yeah, I'd rather be fishing."
Among the most famous and evil men to be executed in the chair was Robert Willie. Willie had been convicted of raping a young girl and then killing her. While on death row, he was befriended by Sister Helen Préjean, a Roman Catholic nun who worked with prison inmates. Her published memoirs of their conversations became the basis for the acclaimed movie Dead Man Walking.
I knew Robert Willie. In fact, I handled his deal when he was put to death, and I knew his dad. His dad served time here. His name was John Willie, and he was one of the old inmate guards. And he told me, he said, "My son is coming to death row." He said, "If you'll let me get to him, you won't have to execute him, I'll kill him."
Robert Willie's execution was carried out on December 28, 1984.
He had said he was going, you know, that he was going to fight and he was going to do it, but he walked up and sat down in a chair just like all the rest of them did. They say he was smiling, looking at the sister when he, you know, the last thing he did. And I buckled him down in a chair and then I stepped out.
Angola's wooden electric chair was retired in 1991. Still, there is no shortage of those who are waiting to be put to death. Today, the names of Louisiana's 84 death row inmates fill one wall in Angola's identification office. Each waits, hoping for a court decision that would spare his life. Most will spend their final hours here in one of the prison's death watch cells. Then they will be led on their final walk to Angola's new execution chamber. It is here that the condemned prisoner is strapped to a padded table with both arms out and prepared to receive a lethal injection.
I usually see the fear in his face that I'm sure that he saw in the victim, and I think of that, and I think, you know, I wish this was televised because people who are prone to murder others could see it really could happen to you.
5 convicted murderers have died in Angola's lethal injection room since the table was installed in 1991.
The first man I executed bothered me really pretty bad the next day because I took a perfectly healthy human being in there and laid him on the table and killed him. That's what I did. I vowed that I wouldn't execute another man that I didn't talk to about his soul, and I haven't. And the next 3 I've executed, I actually held her hand while he died. We do it with dignity, and we all say a prayer before we do it, and I hope we're not doing something wrong. That's the law of the land. We're carrying it out.
The law of the land. For most of Angola's 5,000 prisoners, it says that they will die here too, only more slowly. Maximum security and open farmland. They have continued to coexist at Louisiana's Angola State Prison despite the odds against it. Over time, as the basic needs for security have been met, prison officials have allowed some recreation into the prison program. While Angola adopted the traditional sports of other prisons, namely baseball and boxing, the last 40 years have brought a dramatic addition. It began with a few inmates and staff performing ranch tricks to entertain each other. But it has grown into an annual event that officials and inmates call the wildest rodeo in the South. Today, fans in the rodeo stands forget they are sitting in a maximum security prison.
Well, you got people from all walks of life coming in here to watch it, and actually riding in it and putting it on is strictly inmates, volunteer participants.
The inmates, many of whom are serving life sentences, are flung around by angry bulls and wild horses as thousands marvel at their death-defying stunts. Many believe that it is far more exciting than a regular rodeo because the inmates have nothing to lose. But after the spectators have gone and the rodeo grounds are cleared, the reality of life at Angola returns for another year. Reality. Like sexual predator John Simonis, who arrived here in 1982. Newspapers called him the ski mask rapist because he preferred to torture his female victims and their husbands while wearing a knit mask. To make sure he never goes free, Simonis was given a string of sentences that total more than 2,000 years. Although such a judgment is reserved for the most monstrous of offenders, any prisoner with a life sentence at Angola is likely to stay here until he dies.
When I come to work here, an inmate serving a life sentence ordinarily meant 10 years and 6 months. They automatically was placed on the pardon board by the wardens.
But the politics of punishment in Louisiana have closed the window on parole. Today, life at Angola means life.
It's going to be an expensive old folks' home, is what Angola's becoming.
Every year, a growing number of Angola's inmates join the $1 Million Club, the amount of money it costs to keep a man in prison more than 35 years. Walter Culbreth is serving a life sentence for murder.
I never have had a chance to go to court with a lawyer, my witness, or let my people know I was going to court. Oh my God, what could I do? Huh? I ain't got no lawyer. I got to come there and go.
Culbreth has spent nearly 60 years at Angola.
I'm old, 89 years old, so I don't let nothing worry me. All I need is out. That's all I need is out. I don't need nothing else but out. But to be free.
With prison resources stretched to their limits, many wonder if Walter Culbreth and others like him still belong here.
Who do you want in prison? Dying old men or predators? What you want to do? And we have just so many beds. I have 5,108 beds, and I'm filling them up with a lot of them with old men who can't commit the crime anymore. And so it's really kind of foolish. You ought to have predators in here, but you know, I don't make the law, I just carry out the law.
For Angola's lifers, even death is no escape. The original prison cemetery, called Point Lookout, is filled to capacity. Inmates who die in Angola with no family to claim them are now buried across the road.
And so we send more to the cemetery than we actually release out the front gate.
To keep the burials dignified, 2 inmates trained in woodworking spend their days making coffins and preparing them for funerals. Still, life grinds on at Angola. Inmates publish a monthly magazine called The Angolite, with prison news and editorials. And radio KLSP, the prison's incarceration station, broadcasts music and prayers over the 28 square miles of Angola.
Folks call me Rockin' Robin. We're broadcasting from Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, station that kicks behind the bricks.
Throughout its 130-year history, this vast open landscape has been called a plantation, a prison farm, and a penitentiary.
We're to protect the public from the prisoners and protect the prisoners from themselves and the guard.
In that time, it has struggled to find a balance between humanity and security.
That's our basic mission. That's why we're here. All this other is secondary.
Between punishment and reform.
And so you got to keep it straight. If you run away, we're going to shoot you. But we're going to shoot the warning shot first. Just business.
Between preserving life and taking it away. Entertainers. Robert Willey, convicted murderer. His story inspired the movie Dead Man Walking. John B. Simonis, the ski mask rapist, locked up here for a string of sexual attacks that spanned 12 states. The legendary blues singer, Leadbelly, convicted of attempted murder, recorded his first song here. The story of Louisiana State Penitentiary begins in 1869, 4 years after the end of the Civil War. At that time, nearly half the people living in the state were recently freed slaves. Unskilled, illiterate, and unable to make a living, many turned to crime. Their offenses ranged from larceny and breaking and entering to horse thievery and forcible rape. The wave of lawbreakers was too much for Louisiana's few jails to cope with. And so the state found a place to house this growing convict population, a huge expanse of land that would eventually encompass 18,000 acres. Originally a slave plantation, it was named for the region in Africa where many slaves had been born, Angola. The 28-square-mile plantation was, and still is, the largest state prison.
Lives of the prisoners. He was only interested in the profit he could gain from the work that they did.
Inmates toiled from dawn to darkness. Their backbreaking tasks included building levees to prevent floods, planting corn, picking cotton, and cutting sugarcane.
This is a line pusher stick, and it was used by the person that was setting the pace in the cane field. And if the other prisoners were not working as hard or doing what he thought they should do, he'd prod them along. Sometimes they'd probably whack them, several whacks.
Before 1900, the average lifespan for an Angola inmate was just 5 years. The food was poor, and early records list malaria and dysentery among the illnesses that might go untreated. Major James summed up his regard for the prisoners with a grim phrase: "One dies, get another."
The meaning of that being that if a convict died at Angola, then the next boatload coming up the river from Baton Rouge brought you another convict to replace him.
More than 100 years later, Angola's prisoners still call it the farm. They still work the land under armed guard.
You get up in the morning and you go into the fields, and you might be in a line of 40, 50 other people. And we're kind of like walking like zombies. We didn't know where we were going. And you just go in the field and do what they tell you to do, and it seems like everything work all right. And if you do as you was instructed, do the best you can do.
While their work hours have been reduced to reflect modern penal philosophy, the scene is still an eerie reminder of a bygone era.
It's a humongous big old prison farm. We have 2,000 acres of corn and soybeans and cotton. We produce 4 million pounds of vegetables. You're passing by some of the agricultural area now. We work with horses and mules, and we work with modern tractors, so we won't see that in any other prison, really. We do a lot of primitive work and hand work. We harvest the cotton by hand, and we harvest the vegetables by hand. Why not? We have the labor.
Working like slaves.
For the first convicts at Angola, life was an earthly hell. Improvements would come, but slowly, and only after a legacy of brutality and bloodshed had been firmly established. When it opened in 1869, Louisiana's state prison at Angola challenged its staff with vast distances and open spaces. In America, bordered on 3 sides by the Mississippi River, it is very nearly an island.
So if you were picking a location to isolate convicts from the rest of society, you could not really find a more ideal location than Angola. It's probably one of the most remote physical locations, not only in Louisiana, but probably in the United States.
Initially, Angola was not operated by the state, but as a private enterprise. The idea came from a former major in the Confederate Army, Samuel Lawrence James. After the war, James made a deal with the state of Louisiana. He would pay to house and feed the prisoners. In exchange, he was permitted to use them as laborers.
He took the mostly black convicts who were recently freed slaves and put them to doing the same type of labor that they would have done pre-Civil War under slavery.
It was punishment for profit. The plantation prison even had its own cotton gin. But critics labeled it as nothing more than a new form of slavery.
Probably it was worse than the early slave plantations, because the slave owners had bought and paid for the slaves, so they took care of them. But Samuel James had no regard for the
hills.
We went in with shotguns and pick handles and whatever, you know, and we stopped whatever was going on. If one got hit in the process, he just got hit.
During its 130-year history, Angola has recorded chilling scenes of misery, escape, and murder.
he was able to smuggle this meat cleaver to his dormitory, and during the night he attacked 2 prisoners, and they never knew what hit them.
Most of the inmates who survived the violence will never see the outside world again.
Majority, half of them here are, have life sentences, and that's going to be for murder or some kind of, drug thing, and then 85% of them thereabouts will probably die here.
To keep its 5,000 inmates inside, the prison is equipped to chase them down through fields, over water, and far into the dense backcountry of Louisiana. To carry out the state's wishes, Angola is also prepared to administer the ultimate punishment: execution. Over time, Angola has housed a diverse group, from murderers and sex offenders to criminals who had been singers and